Here in central Michigan, almost everybody hunts. Whether it's deer, rabbit, squirrel, turkey, or quail, we all hunt. So it's pretty common while I'm hunting on state land to run into a few other hunters. Normally, it's just frustrating. You pick your spot, settle in, and sit quietly for an hour, only to have some guy wander 20 yards from your tree stand right at prime time. This evening was one of those times when my hunt was interrupted. Only instead of getting angry at first, I was concerned, followed quickly by being terrified out of my mind. I got out to my stand around 4:30 p.m., got all settled in, and sat freezing my butt off for the next hour and a half just watching the snowstorm come down. It was starting to get dark pretty quickly when, to my left, I heard the sound every hunter loves hearing. Footsteps. My heart immediately started to pump faster as my adrenaline kicked in. Very slowly, I turned my head left so I wouldn't alert the animal coming in that I was waiting 20 feet up in the tree. Instead of seeing a deer walking up, though, it was a man. Instantly, my adrenaline turned to anger as, yet again, my hunt was ruined. I stared him down, hoping he would look up and notice me in the tree, then turn around and go back the way he came, so there'd be a slight chance I could still see some deer. Once he got about 20 feet from my stand, I noticed something was off about him. His body was completely stiff, his arms glued to his side, and he stared straight forward with a stone expression on his face. His legs, however, were taking these huge, high knee steps, like he was sort of marching or exercising. "The fuck?" I whispered to myself. I was a little creeped out by his odd behavior, but not really scared yet. After a few seconds of watching him, I figured he was some asshole intentionally ruining my hunt. I was just about to shout out to the weirdo and ask what the hell he was doing when a twig snapped a little ways off to my right. The guy froze and his head snapped in the direction where the noise came from. He stared for a few seconds, then out of nowhere, he took off running impossibly fast toward whatever had caused the twig to snap. I stared, slack-jawed, at how fast this guy was running. I kid you not, he had to have been running well over 30 miles an hour as he closed 60 or 70 yards in about 4 seconds. As he got to a tree, he scaled it faster than a fucking squirrel can. My heart was hammering so loud at this point, I actually feared he would hear it and come for me next. The sounds of an animal screeching as it was being torn apart rang through the woods. Whatever it was, he caught it and was, what I'm guessing, eating it alive. After a couple of seconds of screeching, the woods fell completely silent, other than my frantic breathing. I closed my eyes and took 3 deep, slow breaths to settle my nerves. When I opened my eyes back up, my heart took another leap as the guy was standing 20 feet away, looking down in the snow at something. My footprints in snow. Oh God, please no. I thought to myself. I'm not ashamed to admit I was in tears at this point. I was so afraid. I slowly reached to my side and put my hand on my pistol I always carry with me in case it came down to me shooting this guy. I watched in horror as he slowly followed my footsteps. He crept along until he stood directly under my tree. Then he slowly lifted his head up until he looked directly at me. We stared at each other for a couple of seconds until he put his hand on the ladder leading to my stand, getting ready to climb up. I was completely paralyzed in fear as I watched him slowly pull himself up the first step. Then, by the grace of God, I heard a voice somewhere in the distance. The creepy guy heard it too, and he hopped back down onto the ground. "Jim, I got one," I heard the guy in the distance shout to someone, probably his buddy. The guy under my stand took off running as fast as before toward the other hunter's voice. I saw my only chance to get out of there, so I undid my harness in record time and practically jumped out of the tree and started running back to my truck. Thankfully, I wasn't too far in and soon saw it over the small hill. I looked back to see if he was chasing me, but I was in the clear. Wow. I got to my truck, threw my bow in, and jumped in, starting it and pulling away as fast as I could. With snow, I wasn't able to drive as quickly as I wanted, but after an intense 10 minutes, I was back on the main road. I don't know what the hell that was, but I know one thing. I'm not hunting on state land ever again. One day last year, I was hunting from a ground blind on the edge of a field near a small stream. On the other end of the creek lies a densely wooded area that ascends steeply for about 100 yards. We call this area the thicket. This property is located roughly 2 hours northeast of Atlanta, Georgia. It was a cool and overcast morning with a very light, misty rain. It had been uneventful up to this point, as there had been no animal activity all morning. Roughly 30 minutes into my sight, I heard something walking down the hill from the thicket at about my 4 o'clock. I assumed it was a deer, as I could tell by the footfalls that it was a sizable animal, and there are really no other medium to large-sized animals around here. It got about to the edge of the water, probably about 30 or so yards from me, and stopped. The back windows of my blind were closed so as not to silhouette myself from the front, so I couldn't see anything. It was quiet for a minute. Then, I felt something very small hit the roof of the blind. I was under a tree, so I didn't think much of it. It could have been an acorn, but about 30 seconds later, I felt another impact. This one still near the top, but on the side of the blind. This occurrence led me to conclude that something hadn't just fallen on my blind. Something had thrown it. Thoughts started to enter my mind. What the hell could be out here throwing rocks at my blind? And why? I didn't have much time to ponder other thoughts before this thing stepped into the creek with a resounding splash. As it took its time stomping around in the creek, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to slowly stand up, open the side flap of the blind, and see what had been causing me so much grief. Nothing. Not in the creek, the field, the trees, nowhere. I sat back down and tried to wrap my head around what the hell was going on. But after only about 30 seconds, it all started right back up. But in addition to the water treading, it was now making the occasional soft vocalization, sort of a grunting type sound. This thing now had my full attention. When I hunt, I usually carry 3 things with me: a hunting knife, a 9mm pistol, and my primary hunting rifle, a Browning X-Bolt chambered in .3 short magnum. If you don't know what any of that means, the short version is it's a very powerful rifle with a massive bullet. To this day, I've never had a deer run away and bleed out somewhere with this gun. They're always dead before they hit the ground, usually from blunt force trauma. The reason I tell you this is to highlight the fact that at the time I wasn't exactly defenseless, quite the opposite. And as the noises from just on the other side of the mesh continued to escalate, I came to the conclusion that my only way out of this encounter was confrontation. I stood up, unzipped the blind, and stepped out into the open field, took the safety off my shoulder cannon, and turned towards the creek to face my assailant. I don't know what I expected to see, but what I saw next was nothing. Again. No, that's impossible, I thought aloud. It was right there. What the hell was going on? I didn't care how much firepower I had at this point. Nothing that big and heavy could just vanish into thin air without so much as making a sound. It was time to get the hell out of there, and now. My RTV was parked about 150 yards away on the other side of the field, and then it was about half a mile back to the house. But as I turned to make my retreat, I couldn't even take one step before I heard it. A grunt, and then heavy footfalls. I turned to see nothing but could still hear it walking slowly back up into the thicket. And this time, I swear I could hear it breathing. I haven't hunted that field again, nor do I plan to. My dad was never much of an outdoorsman until after high school, when the allure of the wilderness began to call to him. Hunting became his way of connecting with nature, and soon he and his best friend made it an annual tradition to venture into the remote wilderness of northern Canada. On their 3rd trip to a familiar yet secluded spot, they set up camp by a serene lake surrounded by the dense forest that characterizes the northern wilderness. The tranquility of the setting sun and the anticipation of a weekend in the wild filled them with a sense of peace. But as dusk turned to darkness and fatigue began to set in, that peace was shattered by an unexpected sound. Plop! A large splash echoed across the lake, disrupting the stillness of the evening. Puzzled, my dad and his friends scanned the dimming horizon for the source of the disturbance. Before they could make sense of it, another splash sounded, this time alarmingly close. Plop! Right in front of them, a massive rock, easily 50 pounds, had landed with a force that sent ripples across the lake. The realization that something had hurled the rock the entire 200 yards across the water struck them with a mix of confusion and terror. Without hesitation, my dad dashed into the tent, retrieving his binoculars for a closer look. That's when he saw it, a figure, towering at 6'9", silhouetted against the fading light. Details were hard to discern, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary man. Its stature alone suggested a strength that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Then came the scream, a deep, bellowing roar that seemed to shake the very air around them. In a panic, my dad grabbed his gun, firing into the distance in a desperate attempt to scare off whatever it was that they were dealing with. But the creature didn't flee. Instead, it gave off a vibe that seemed to say, "You're not in charge here." Slowly, deliberately, it retreated into the woods, leaving behind a silence that was more unsettling than its roar. For the remainder of the trip, the forest felt devoid of life, as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. My dad and his friend were too frightened to venture far from camp, the encounter weighing heavily on their minds. Upon returning home, my dad did some research, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. The only explanation that seemed to fit was that they had encountered Bigfoot. Skeptics might scoff, but my dad has never been one to believe easily in tall tales. Yet, what he experienced that day in northern Canada was enough to convince him that there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation. About 5 years ago, my dad wanted to take me hunting. We also brought our dog, God rest his soul. My dad took us to our old getaway home in the Carpathians, and we planned to spend 4 days there during the fall. The first day wasn't so bad because we just ate and watched movies. However, the second day, we hiked up the mountain to set up camp for hunting. As night fell on day 2, we had our night vision goggles. "Dad, you're a badass for those, thank you," and hunting rifles. We were posted up on a hill surveying the area for game. Things got suspicious when out of nowhere, we heard the loudest scream I've ever heard in my life. It sounded far away but came from down the mountain. Scared shitless, both of us couldn't even make it back to the cabin because of the rain, so we just stayed at the camp and tried to sleep it off. I couldn't sleep. My dad brought the dog into his tent, so I was alone in mine. Around 4 in the morning, I heard sticks breaking outside. Then the outside of my tent rustled. I was nearly pissing myself. I then heard loud breathing and groaning for about an hour before it stopped. The next morning, my dad told me he heard the whole thing. We both agreed to go back to the cabin. On day 3, we were out surveying the area again, as there was a deer we had spotted. My dad went down to track it and told me to stay with the dog, so I did. That's when things got wild. I was sitting in the driveway and heard a loud bang from the cabin. I jumped up from my seat and ran inside the house with my gun. What I saw horrified me. The front window was smashed, but I found nothing inside the house. When my dad got back, he thought maybe someone had thrown a rock at the house, but I told him there wasn't a brick or a rock or anything, and he didn't believe me. On the night of day 3, I sat upstairs, looking out the window with the goggles. Suddenly, I thought I saw something moving about 30 feet away in the trees. I took out the video camera we were using for the deer and zoomed in with it. In the morning, I checked the footage, and it was too dark. But I transferred it to my phone and brightened it so I could see and change the opacity. It was a goddamn terrifying-looking person. They were cloaked, but you could see wrinkly legs and eyes that kind of appeared on the footage. They just stood amongst the trees and waddled off, looking directly at the camera. On the night of day 4, they came back to the grove about 40 feet away, and my dad was still awake, so I yelled for him. He came, and we were too scared to go outside, but the dog was still outside and started barking and ran into the grove. We never saw our dog again. My dad still refuses to talk about this trip to me or anyone else. Click on this next video if you enjoyed for more content like this, and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel.